We have been seeing an increase in the severity and frequency of wildfires in recent years in some areas of the world. So specifically the forests of the world, we've seen an increase in fire occurrence, for example, in Australia, in North America, in Europe. But we also have seen a decrease in fire in some regions that most people are not aware of. So in savanna grasslands, for example, we've seen a distinct decrease over the last few decades. But the increase that we're seeing in the forests is much more important. Because in forest areas, we see greater damage by the fires. We also see more carbon emissions. So there's a big concern about that increase in wildland fires. Yeah, the increase in specifically forest fires around the world has a range of reasons. Of course, climate change is one key reason here. When we warm our atmosphere, it means it can take more water from the vegetation. It can dry out the vegetation more, and that simply means the vegetation becomes more flammable. As a result, what we see now is that the season for fires around the world has increased in length by over 20% over the last 4 decades or so. So we see a lot more fires around the world, not everywhere, but particularly in the northern hemisphere, especially in boreal areas, and especially in the Mediterranean region. And when it burns, those fires are often more severe than they used to be. There's another really important factor in there, and especially in Europe, because what we're seeing is that the area of flammable vegetation, that is forest, that is shrubland, is increasing, especially in the Mediterranean area. And this is largely to do with the rural depopulation. A lot of people don't farm the land anymore in the most remote areas, or maybe some areas even around the cities. And that means we have a strong vegetation growth, we have more shrubs, we have more forests, and we therefore have a more flammable landscape. There are a number of regions around the world where wildfires have always been common, but the risk is increasing. So, for example, if we take the Mediterranean area, the Mediterranean climate is a climate that has a summer drought. It's perfectly normal not to see rainfall, perhaps for 3 or 4 months in parts of Greece, in parts of southern France, in parts of Spain. So that is perfectly normal. But what we're also seeing is that the heat waves there are increasing. If we have, say, 30 degrees for 3 weeks or have 35 degrees for 3 weeks, that makes a big difference, because if we have higher temperatures, the vegetation will be drier and the risk of fire is simply increasing. If these fires then are combined with strong winds, and this is something we've seen in France recently, we've seen in Greece, then those fires spread very rapidly, and this makes them especially dangerous. The changes we're seeing around the world in terms of rainfall patterns and the increase in heat waves, they play a big role in fire. So those heat waves, they generate weather conditions that we call fire weather. And what we've seen around the world is that the fire weather season has increased by over 20% over the last few decades. So that means we have longer periods of flammable vegetation where it's very dangerous if a flame occurs near a flammable material, and that means the fire can actually grow out of proportion, much more so than if we didn't have a heat wave, for example. And it's all to do with the heat drawing the moisture out of the vegetation. There are a number of things countries can do to adapt wildfires, and many countries have been very good in adapting to fires. For example, Canada, Australia, California, they have very good programs of actually dealing with wildfires. But as the wildfires become more and more severe, we're often not in a position to fight those fires anymore. They basically grow out of proportion, they become impossible to tackle. And one of the things that's been relatively successful in many areas of the world is to reduce the vegetation with prescribed burning. So essentially burn the landscape, at least landscapes that are naturally used to fire, burn those during conditions when the fire risk is low. That means you can remove all the fine fuel, the fine material, and when then a fire arrives under more severe weather conditions, it'll burn much more mildly. There can still be a fire, but the fire is much easier to extinguish. So in short, vegetation management prior to a fire is becoming more and more important. We often hear in the media that so many hectares of forest have been destroyed and so much land has been destroyed. But we have to remember that fire is a natural feature of many environments. The Mediterranean, the boreal forests, these regions are used to fire, and the vegetation will normally recover. It's often us humans that are in the way of the fire, and the more we fight fires, the more we prevent fires from burning, the more the forest will accumulate vegetation and the more flammable it gets. So the firefighters have a very difficult choice to either fight the fire and therefore have a future fire being more severe, or perhaps let it burn in some areas and thereby reducing the risk for fire in the future.